Deep in the remote wilderness of Maine, three women ran what seemed to be a religious sanctuary for over 3 decades. More than 600 women came seeking spiritual healing. Fewer than half ever returned home, and those who did were forever changed. Hidden in the Maine State Archives is the testimony of a lone survivor. It was considered so disturbing that authorities kept it sealed for over a century. Tonight, we uncover what really happened behind the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. But before we begin, this channel isn't for everyone. This is for the bravest souls, the ones willing to stare into the darkest corners of America's past. If you dare to discover the truth of what happened here, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to join our circle of true mystery seekers? What makes this case so terrifying is that it wasn't born of religious fanaticism or some supernatural curse. It was something much colder, the calculated pursuit of forbidden knowledge, carried out at any human cost, hidden behind a mask of Christian charity. In the late 18th century, Maine was still part of Massachusetts, a harsh wilderness where isolated settlements fought to survive brutal winters. The coastal town of Millbridge, home to just 300 souls, served as a small trading post for lumber merchants and fishermen who braved the Atlantic. 15 miles inland beyond the thick pine forests and faint native hunting trails, sat a tract of land that would soon be forever marked by horror. The Ashford women arrived in Millbridge on a gray October morning in 1798. Their wagon, drawn by tired horses, was loaded with heavy wooden crates and strange medical instruments that caught the townsfolk's eye. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford stepped down first. She was in her early 40s, silver streaks cutting through her dark hair, her steel-gray eyes cool and calculating. She spoke with the poised accent of English nobility and carried herself like a woman accustomed to absolute obedience. Behind her came Sister Prudence Ashford, tall and thin, with unerringly pale hands that moved with surgeon's precision. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her Scottish-tinged voice carried a chill that even hardened frontiersmen found unsettling. Last step Temperance Ashford, barely 22, and almost too beautiful to be real, her raven black hair framed porcelain skin and dark, watchful eyes. Yet there was something about her beauty that made mothers draw their children closer. Her smile never reached her eyes, and she watched people weigh a collector study's rare specimens. The Ashfords claimed to be Anglican nuns fleeing persecution in England. They presented impressive letters of recommendation, later revealed as masterful forgeries, and convinced the small Protestant community they were a civilizing force for the frontier. With a seemingly endless supply of gold coins, they bought nearly 200 acres of remote forest from a widow desperate to pay her late husband's debts. The sisters paid 3 times the asking price, enough to win the cooperation of local officials and the gratitude of the entire town. Within days, they hired every carpenter, mason, and laborer they could find to build their new sanctuary. What rose from the forest over the next 8 months looked nothing like a convent. 3 stories of cold gray stone, walls thick enough to swallow sound, and windows so high and small that no one could see inside. The basement, far larger, more fortified than needed, was the most unsettling feature. When asked about its purpose, Agatha only smiled and said, "Penitence requires solitude, and solitude requires proper containment." Most locals accepted this answer, though a few wondered why a house of God looked more like a fortress. The sisters oversaw every detail of construction, ordering unusual additions, reinforced doors with heavy locks, oversized drainage systems, and complex ventilation shafts that seemed more suitable for a hospital than a convent. When questioned, they dismissed concerns, saying this was standard practice for intensive spiritual healing in Europe. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a respected physician who traveled between frontier settlements, quickly became one of the sisters' earliest and most vocal supporters. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a man known for his progressive medical thinking, was immediately intrigued by the sisters. He was astonished at their apparent understanding of female psychology and mental illness, subjects that most doctors of his time barely acknowledged. In his journal, he wrote, "Their methods, though unconventional, rest upon principles that may be decades ahead of modern American medicine. They seek to cure the root of mental disturbance, not merely mask its symptoms. But what Dr. Hartwell didn't include in his official notes was a private arrangement he made with Mother Superior Agatha. In exchange for referring difficult patients to the convent and using his medical connections to provide them with supplies, he would receive generous monthly payments and access to the detailed case studies they produced. For a struggling frontier physician, it was an offer he could not refuse. Soon, the convent's reputation spread like wildfire. Families from as far as Portsmouth, Portland, even Boston began whispering about the miraculous Ashford sisters, women who could transform rebellious daughters and troubled wives into perfect models of obedience. The price was steep. $20 silver for a month of treatment, $50 for 3 months, $100 for what the sisters called complete reformation. But for desperate families, it was a small price to pay for peace, respectability, and silence. The women sent to the Convent of Eternal Tears were those who had stepped outside the narrow rules of early 19th century society. Unwed mothers who refused to name the fathers of their children, wives who dared to publicly challenge their husband's authority, daughters who rejected arranged marriages, or who read too many books or spoke too freely about politics. Religious tensions also fed the convent's work. Puritan families sent daughters who flirted with Anglican or Methodist teachings, while Anglicans disposed of daughters drawn to the fire of Baptist revival meetings. The Ashford sisters welcomed them all, insisting their discipline transcended any church or denomination. For years, the convent operated in an eerie kind of silence, until one bitter February night in 1803, when a 20-year-old trapper named Thomas Brewster was out hunting in the woods near the convent. He had been tracking a wounded deer for hours through deep snow when strange sounds froze him in his tracks. Thomas knew the forest. He knew every sound, the crack of ice-laden branches, the far-off howl of wolves, the sigh of wind through the pines. But this was different. Faint at first, then growing louder, came the sound of screaming. Not the cry of an animal, but human screaming. It rose and fell in waves, breaking into desperate whimpers before surging back into raw, primal shrieks of agony. Abandoning his quarry, Thomas crept closer, his heart pounding. The convent loomed like a black shadow against the winter sky, its windows dark. But as he circled toward the back, he saw it, a faint, flickering glow coming from narrow basement windows, half buried by snow. The screaming grew louder with every step. Now he could hear other sounds, the clink of metal instruments, urgent whispers, and something that sounded disturbingly like sawing. Through a frost-rimmed window, Thomas saw a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The basement had been transformed into a surgical theater, lit by dozens of oil lamps. A woman lay strapped to a heavy wooden table, her head locked in a cruel metal frame. Her hair was partially shaved, her pale scalp marked with black ink. Sister Prudence stood over her, face flushed with concentration, holding a long, thin metal instrument. Mother Superior Agatha calmly took notes in a leather-bound book. Novice Temperance moved silently, handing instruments to her sister with the precision of a trained assistant. And then Thomas saw it, the terrible truth. The woman's skull had been opened. He could see bone, and beneath it, the glistening darkness of exposed brain tissue. The woman's screams reached a final, piercing crescendo, then cut off, leaving a ringing silence. Thomas staggered back from the window, terror gripping his chest. The sisters did not even pause. They continued their work with cold, mechanical precision, as if they were dissecting an animal instead of a living, breathing human being. Thomas ran blindly into the night, crashing through the snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What he had seen was no act of healing. It was something far worse. And in that moment, Thomas knew. This was not the first time such horrors had taken place within those stone walls. When Thomas stumbled back into town the next morning, he was half frozen, exhausted, and shaking. He burst into his father's blacksmith shop, speaking so quickly and with such panic that the elder Brewster at first feared his son had gone mad. breathless. Thomas told him everything. The screaming, the basement, the instruments, the terrible sound of bone being cut. His father listened in grim silence, his weathered hands resting on the anvil. When Thomas finally fell quiet, the old man spoke carefully. "You were hunting alone in a blizzard, after tracking a wounded animal for hours. The mind can play terrible tricks under such strain. Perhaps what you saw was a medical procedure. The sisters are known to treat women with strange ailments." But Thomas's words were too clear, too precise. He described the exact layout of the basement chamber, the instruments glinting in the lamplight, and, most chilling of all, the cold, professional detachment with which the sisters worked. This was not the frenzied cruelty of madness. It was systematic, planned, practiced. The elder Brewster, troubled, decided to take the matter to Deacon Morrison, the most respected man in town and its moral compass. Morrison was a careful man, known for his measured decisions and commitment to keeping peace in the community. The Ashford sisters had lived among them for 5 years without incident. Generous donors, proper in their behavior, and unfailingly polite. And, as Morrison pointed out, several of the town's most prominent families currently had wives and daughters undergoing treatment at the convent. "We must tread very carefully," Morrison warned after hearing Thomas's account. Accusations of this kind could destroy reputations and divide the entire community. Surely there is a reasonable explanation. Still, the deacon felt it was his duty to at least make a discreet inquiry. The following week, he rode to the convent under the pretense of discussing an upcoming church fundraising event. Mother Superior Agatha received him in the convent's parlor, a sparse, cold room dominated by a looming wooden crucifix and dark religious paintings that seemed to follow him with their eyes. Agatha was calm, gracious, and perfectly composed as she poured tea, asking politely about his family's health. When Morrison carefully mentioned that hunters had reported strange noises at night, her expression softened into one of understanding and concern. "We often hold the most intense prayer sessions during the still hours of night," she explained in her smooth, cultured voice. "The process of spiritual cleansing can be quite vocal. Many of our patients are deeply afflicted, possessed by demons of pride, lust, and rebellion. Such forces do not leave the soul quietly." Her words were delivered with such solemnity and conviction that Morrison found himself nodding. The idea of spiritual warfare was familiar to every Christian in that era, and the thought of corrupted souls fighting against salvation felt plausible, even noble. Agatha then offered him a tour of the upper levels of the convent. The dormitories were simple but spotless. Women sat silently in prayer or meditation, their faces pale, their movements slow and strangely mechanical, like sleepwalkers. When Morrison tried to catch their eyes, they seemed to stare through him, as if focused on something far away, something unseen. When the deacon asked about the basement, Agatha's serene smile never wavered. "That is where we conduct our most private spiritual work," she explained gently. "It would be inappropriate for a man to witness such intimate procedures. The dignity of the soul must be preserved." Within the strict social norms of the time, this answer was perfectly reasonable. Morrison left the convent reassured, or so he told himself. But during the long ride home, an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. The women he had seen seemed too quiet, too controlled, as if their wills had been stripped away. And there had been a smell in the air, faint but unforgettable. Not just the sharp tang of cleaning solutions or herbs, but something darker, coppery, something that reminded him of battlefield hospitals during the Revolutionary War, where the air itself seemed saturated with blood. In the weeks following Morrison's visit, the convent became even more secretive. The piercing screams that had once echoed to the forest ceased altogether, replaced by a suffocating, watchful silence that seemed far more ominous. Still, local families continued to send their daughters. Families continued sending troubled women to the convent, and the Ashford sisters continued welcoming them with open arms and ever more ambitious promises of transformation. But soon, watchful neighbors began noticing a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The women who returned were not redeemed. They were different. Take Mary Prescott, for example. At 19, Mary was known throughout Millbury for her sharp wit, infectious laughter, and fierce independence, qualities that scandalized her strict parents. After she rejected 3 suitors, her family finally sent her to convent for 6 months of spiritual preparation. When she returned, her parents were at first delighted. Gone was a rebellious daughter who argued about everything from housework to theology. But what replaced her was far worse. Mary spoke only when spoken to. She showed no opinions, no preferences, agreeing to the first marriage proposal offered as though she were reciting lines in a play. At first, her parents praised the sisters for their miracle, but soon dread crept in. Mary no longer recognized her favorite foods, her childhood toys, or even letters she had written before her stay. She looked at them with blank confusion, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Most terrifying of all, Mary showed no emotion at all. No joy, no sorrow, no laughter, just a hollow, obedient shell. When her mother bathed her one night, she noticed thin scars hidden beneath Mary's hair, deliberate, curved lines that looked nothing like accidental injuries. Mary, when asked, could remember nothing. "I just prayed very hard to become a better woman," she said softly. And she smiled, a small, empty smile that chilled her mother to the bone. Mary was not the only one. Hannah Morse, sent to the convent after falling into deep grief over the death of her infant son, came back smiling, unnaturally cheerful, insisting she had never had a child. When shown the baby's clothes and toys, she merely tilted her head, confused, as though someone were playing a cruel joke. But the most disturbing case was Elizabeth Thornton. Elizabeth had been committed to the convent after publicly accusing her wealthy husband of adultery and demanding a divorce, behavior that threatened to ruin both families. For months later, she returned a changed woman. She withdrew her accusations, insisting that her marriage had always been happy, and that she had never accused her husband of anything. But something was wrong. Elizabeth complained of terrible headaches and often seemed lost in her own home, forgetting the names of lifelong friends, misplacing simple objects, and staring at familiar streets as though she had never seen them before. Like the others, she bore small scars on her scalp. And like the others, she claimed to remember nothing of how they were made. Despite the growing unease in town, Dr. Hartwell praised these cases as the convent's greatest successes. "The rebellious spirit has been removed," he wrote. "The patients are now fit for marriage and motherhood, their defects erased." But behind closed doors, Hartwell was unraveling. He drank heavily, muttered about necessary sacrifices, and filled his journals with increasingly disturbed reflections. "The procedures I have witnessed defy every principle of medical ethics I once held sacred. And yet, the results are undeniable. The sisters have done what European physicians only dream of, altering memory, reshaping personality, extinguishing defiance at its root. History must decide whether we are visionaries advancing human knowledge or monsters." Meanwhile, the convent's ties to Europe deepened. Postal workers noticed a constant flow of packages and letters, shipments of medical texts, surgical tools, chemical compounds, and crates of strange, carefully sealed specimens. Mother Superior Agatha began traveling to Portland and Boston each month, returning with shipments that locals were warned not to touch. To curious neighbors, she explained that the convent was at the cutting edge of medicine, combining Christian discipline with the latest European science. And for a time, that explanation was enough. But not for everyone. Some residents began whispering that whatever was happening inside those gray stone walls was no miracle. It was something else entirely. Martha Goodwin was not the kind of woman who accepted silence as an answer. When her own daughter, Rebecca, returned from the convent as a hollow-eyed stranger, Martha began quietly questioning other families. What she discovered chilled her. None of the women who had undergone intensive treatment in the convent's basement remembered anything except fragmented prayers and murmured hymns, and some never returned at all. When desperate families inquired about their missing daughters or wives, the Ashford sisters would smile serenely and claimed that the women had experienced such profound spiritual awakening that they had chosen to remain forever within the convent, dedicating their lives to God. But when families begged to see them, they were politely but firmly turned away. They have taken vows of silence and seclusion, the sisters would explain. The outside world is closed to them now. Martha's suspicions only grew when she discovered that women were now being sent to the remote Maine convent from as far away as New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Wealthy families were willing to pay staggering sums for what the sisters called comprehensive reformation, a 6-month program that promised to eliminate every trace of disobedience, rebellion, or melancholy from a young woman's soul. The price? $500. By the time the convent entered its second decade, the Ashford sisters were being celebrated as leading authorities on female mental disorders. Their name was whispered with reverence in both American and European medical circles. One of their most dedicated admirers was Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School, who maintained a correspondence with the sisters for over 15 years. His preserved letters, now in the Harvard archives, reveal a man awestruck by their work. Your documentation of behavioral modification techniques surpasses anything I have encountered in contemporary European literature. The precision with which you connect physical interventions to predictable personality changes suggests a mastery of brain function that our profession will not achieve for decades. What Whitmore never realized was that he was reading clinical descriptions of what we now know as primitive lobotomy, trepanation, and deliberate brain injury. The Ashford sisters had gone further than any legitimate researcher dared, and they had done so without oversight, without consent, and without mercy. Their methods were meticulous. Each woman's personality traits were carefully cataloged before treatment. Every procedure was recorded in exacting detail, with sketches and measurements that would later shock medical historians. Sister Prudence had by now become an expert in what she chillingly referred to as targeted cranial intervention. Her surviving diagrams, discovered decades later, show precise entry points into the skull, each one calculated to access specific regions of the brain. But the most disturbing revelation was that the women were kept partially conscious during the operations. Sedated with laudanum but never fully unconscious, they were questioned and commanded as the sisters adjusted their instruments. Their responses used as real-time feedback to gauge the effects of every cut, every probe. Meanwhile, Sister Temperance had perfected the art of what she called behavioral reconstruction. She subjected the women to carefully designed programs of reward and punishment, controlling their food, their sleep, their temperature, and their access to human contact, until every trace of their old personality was stripped away. Chemical experimentation soon became a regular part of the process. The sisters used their growing network of European contacts to obtain rare drugs, testing combinations that wouldn't be seen in mainstream medicine for decades. By 1815, over 400 women had been processed through the convent. The Ashford sisters boasted a success rate of over 90%. Though they defined success as a complete eradication of whatever personality traits had prompted a woman's confinement in the first place. Those who did not survive were marked as failures. Their bodies were preserved for further study, and when there were no more troubled daughters to reform, the sisters found new subjects, what they called research volunteers. Destitute women with no families, no one to miss them, were lured to the convent with promises of food and shelter, and were never seen outside its walls again. The experiments were not merely crude attempts at reform. They were deliberate research projects designed to advance medical understanding of the so-called feminine mind. Women with no families, prostitutes, vagrants, widows, became the Ashford sisters' test subjects. Hidden archives discovered decades later revealed a meticulous record of their atrocities. Precise skull measurements, notes on brain tissue reactions, and careful documentation of which surgical cuts produce which changes in personality. Even worse, the sisters turned their findings into currency. They sold data to European and American researchers who could not, or would not, conduct such experiments themselves. Letters discovered years later exposed a thriving black market in human experimentation. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna became one of their most lucrative clients, paying handsomely for instructions on how to erase memories, dull emotions, and create what he chillingly called compliant behavioral states. Ironically, the University of Edinburgh, the very place that had once expelled Agatha Brennan, unknowingly bought the Ashford's research through intermediaries. Their techniques became part of legitimate medical curriculum, taught to generations of physicians without ever knowing the bloody cost. By the late 1810s, the Ashford sisters were accepting custom orders. Wealthy families paid to have specific traits removed from their daughters: artistic ambitions, intellectual curiosity, stubborn independence, and at a higher price, had them rebuilt into perfectly obedient wives. But in the winter of 1818, the first serious crack appeared in the Ashfords' carefully maintained facade. Her name was Sarah Whitman. Unlike the usual broken and desperate women who arrived at the convent, Sarah came as a fighter, sharp-witted, stubborn, and very much alive. Her crime was giving birth out of wedlock and refusing to reveal the father's identity. Her powerful Boston family, fearing scandal, had first tried to arrange a discreet marriage and later an adoption. Sarah refused both, insisting on her right to keep her child and live independently. Declared mentally unfit, she was sent away to the Convent of Eternal Tears. Sarah was different from the others, educated, medically literate thanks to her father's circle of Boston physicians, and not easily intimidated. From the moment she crossed the convent gates, she sensed its darkness. The other women moved with eerie uniformity, their faces blank, their eyes unfocused, their voices flat. Many bore scalp scars thinly hidden by regrown hair. Sarah recognized the symptoms immediately: slurred speech, memory gaps, emotionless stares, brain damage. During her first week, Sarah underwent the convent's standard intake procedures: skull measurements, personality interrogations, and bizarre neurological tests disguised as spiritual assessments. Unlike most patients, Sarah resisted. She endured solitary confinement, near starvation, and endless psychological attacks designed to break her mind. Sister Temperance, the convent's master of behavioral conditioning, personally oversaw her case, using every tool at her disposal: sensory deprivation in a pitch-black cell, extreme temperatures that left Sarah shivering or drenched in sweat, sleep deprivation so severe that hallucinations blur reality, verbal degradation that sought to erase every shred of Sarah's identity. But Sarah refused to yield. Instead, she used her suffering as fuel. While locked away, she memorized the sisters' routines, pieced together the building's layout by sound alone, and began plotting her escape. Most importantly, she began documenting everything. She used scraps of fabric and berry juice to create a secret journal, hiding the pages and the seams of her clothing. And then, on a storm-torn night in March 1819, she found her chance. The flooding in the basement shattered the convent's carefully maintained order. Equipment, patients, and records had to be moved to higher floors, and in the midst of the confusion, Sarah found her chance. Slipping away from her watchers, she descended into forbidden parts of the building. And what she discovered below was worse than anything she had imagined. The basement chambers were a nightmare preserved in stone and shadow. The floodwaters lapped against iron operating tables fitted with heavy restraints. Surgical instruments, twisted, gleaming shapes unlike any Sarah had ever seen, were scattered across counters. Glass jars bobbed in the dark water, each containing preserved human brain tissue, neatly labeled with names, dates, and procedural notes. Sarah waded through the cold water. Rifling through the records, she found floating and stacked on high shelves. The files documented procedures that could only be described as deliberate mutilation of the mind. Precise removals of brain tissue, meticulous sketches of open skulls, and detailed notes linking each surgery to changes in memory, personality, and behavior. Even more damning, Sarah found entire bundles of correspondence, letters from European physicians casually discussing payments for research results, and even preserved specimens. It became horrifyingly clear the convent was not a place of healing or penitence. It was a business. Realizing her time was almost up, Sarah hid as many documents as she could inside her clothing. She knew that her scheduled treatment was only days away. If she didn't escape now, she would end up like the hollow-eyed women who wandered the halls, shells of their former selves. Her chance came on a moonless April night. Overpowering one of the guards, she fled into the black wilderness. The Ashford sisters wasted no time. Within hours, search parties combed the forest, their torches glowing like angry fireflies in the distance. They knew exactly what Sarah had seen, and they understood how dangerous she was to their carefully guarded secret. For 3 days, Sarah stumbled through the wilderness, half-starved, barefoot, and bleeding. The sister search parties were relentless. She could hear their shouts echoing through the woods at night, sometimes so close she had to bury herself under leaves and pray they would pass. Once, during a rainstorm, she nearly stumbled right into them, barely escaping by crawling into the hollow of a fallen tree and waiting in silence while they searched only yards away. By the 3rd day, she was near collapse, lips cracked from dehydration, feet raw and torn, her mind hazy from exhaustion. But she kept moving, driven by the knowledge that she carried proof of what was happening inside the convent. Her salvation came at dawn, when she crossed paths with Joshua Meadows, a local trapper. At first he mistook her for a madwoman, a wild-eyed figure emerging from the trees. But when Sarah described the interior of the convent, naming rooms and hidden passages no outsider could know, he believed her. Joshua gave her food, wrapped her in dry clothing, and guided her toward Millbridge. Yet Sarah remained haunted, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting the sisters to appear from the trees at any moment. On April 18, 1819, Sarah staggered into the office of Sheriff William Hawthorne. The lawman was skeptical at first. Her tale sounded too grim, too fantastical. But her knowledge of the convent's hidden rooms and her possession of stolen documents forced him to take her seriously. What Sarah had brought out of the wilderness was more than a story of cruelty. It was evidence that could expose decades of secret human experimentation. Sarah's escape was not just a desperate act of survival. It was the event that ripped the mask from the Ashford sisters' secret world. Hidden inside her clothing were surgical notes, letters from European medical institutions, and a patient registry. Irrefutable proof of what had been happening behind the convent's walls. The first document was a surgical log covering 8 months of procedures performed on 23 women. Each entry read like something out of a nightmare. Skulls drilled open, brain tissue probed or removed, every cut and incision described with cold scientific precision. Preoperative personality profiles, postoperative behavioral observations, and careful notes on cognitive decline followed each case. One entry stood out as especially horrifying. The case of Margaret Fowler, a 19-year-old whose only crime was a love of books and a sharp mind that defied the expectations of her era. The notes described a procedure specifically designed to impair the brain regions responsible for learning and memory, with the goal of eliminating what the sisters called her unfeminine obsession with reading and abstract thought. The procedure was deemed a success. Margaret's intellect had been destroyed, her vocabulary reduced, her curiosity extinguished. The final line of the entry read with chilling satisfaction, "Patient now displays appropriate feminine docility." The second document was a file of letters from Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna. In these letters, Zimmermann negotiated the purchase of cranial intervention data for 4,000 Austrian florins, the equivalent of a small fortune. His requests were specific: techniques for erasing memories, reshaping personalities, and creating what he termed compliant behavioral states. The correspondence revealed the existence of an international black market for human experimentation data, with universities in Edinburgh, Berlin, and Paris quietly buying the sisters' reports. But the third document was the most damning, a catalog listing over 600 women who had passed through the convents in 1798. Each name was annotated with the type of treatment received and the outcome. Most were labeled reformed and returned. Women surgically modified and sent home to their families, changed forever. A smaller number were listed as permanent residents, their current whereabouts unknown. Nearly 200 were marked with a single word: expired. women who had died during or shortly after their procedures. When Sheriff William Hawthorne saw this evidence, he knew at once he was facing crimes that went far beyond his small jurisdiction. He assembled a team of 15 armed men and sent word to Portland and Boston, requesting federal marshals to intervene. But the sisters had been warned. By the time the raiding party reached the convent on May 20th, 1819, it was silent and abandoned. The nuns had fled into the night, taking with them what they could carry and leaving behind the rest. What the sheriff's men found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The basement held a fully equipped surgical theater, tables with restraints, saws, drills, and instruments designed for opening skulls with precision. Shelves lined the walls, each holding glass jars containing preserved brain tissue, neatly labeled with patient names and dates. Behind a false wall, they found something worse. 47 bodies, suspended in chemical solutions, each showing signs of cranial surgery. Each was tagged, not just with name but with meticulous notes on the procedures performed and the results obtained before death. File cabinets stuffed with thousands of pages of notes and letters revealed the staggering scale of the operation. The Ashford sisters had been perfecting their methods for over 2 decades, creating a library of surgical techniques that mainstream medicine would not rediscover for decades to come. When confronted with this evidence, Dr. Samuel Hartwell, who had secretly collaborated with the sisters, initially tried to defend his role. He argued that these women were already lost to society, claiming their suffering had at least contributed to the advancement of medical science. But as the full scale of the atrocities became undeniable, the systematic mutilation, the murders disguised as treatment, even Hartwell could no longer maintain the illusion of righteousness. Sarah Whitman, the sole survivor to escape and expose the truth, became both a hero and a ghost of her own story. Her testimony was taken under guard, copied, and sent to federal authorities, but she herself never fully recovered from the ordeal. Though her actions had dismantled one of the darkest secret enterprises in early American history, she remained haunted by what she had seen. In the years that followed, Sarah lived a quiet, reclusive life in coastal Maine. Locals described her as a watchful presence, a woman who avoided large gatherings and never spoke at the convent except in private conversations with trusted friends. She kept a journal she had written during her imprisonment until her death in 1857, when it was discovered among her belongings and donated to the Historical Society of Maine. The case of the Ashford sisters slowly faded from public memory. The government's decision to seal the official records meant that, for most of the 19th century, the story was dismissed as rumor or local legend, a dark tale whispered to frighten children into obedience. It wasn't until the early 20th century, when the archives were finally unsealed, that historians began piecing together the true scope of the sisters' crimes. Their surgical notes and anatomical drawings are now studied in medical ethics courses as examples of how far the pursuit of science can go when severed from morality. Modern neuroscientists acknowledge that some of the data the sisters collected helped accelerate the understanding of brain function, a grim paradox that continues to fuel debate among medical historians. As for the sisters themselves, no definitive trace was ever found. Theories abound that they fled to Europe and resumed their work under new identities, that they joined one of the emerging medical schools on the continent under assumed names, or that they were eventually murdered by someone seeking revenge. None of these theories have ever been proven. To this day, some locals claim that on stormy nights, when the wind howls across the ruins where the convent once stood, they can hear faint echoes of women's screams carried to the pines, a reminder of the horrors that once took place there. Sarah Whitman never truly escaped the shadow of the convent, though she spent months helping investigators, identifying victims, and piecing together the scope of the Ashford sisters' crimes. The emotional weight nearly broke her. She carried the terrible knowledge that she was the only one willing to speak when everyone else, families, officials, and even clergy, preferred silence. In the end, Sarah fled East Coast society entirely, moving to California under an assumed name. There she worked quietly as a teacher, living a solitary life. She never married, rarely spoke with her family, and never publicly discussed the convent again. Only in her final years did she write her memoir, a harrowing account of life inside the Convent of Eternal Tears, completed shortly before her death in 1863. That document will become the single most detailed historical record of what truly happened in the Maine wilderness. The Ashford sisters were never brought to justice. Reports of their presence surfaced for decades. Whispers of 3 elderly women running private clinics in South America, rumors of strange treatments in Mexico, a sighting in Paris of a physician whose methods bore an uncanny resemblance to Agatha Brennan's work, but none of these leads were ever confirmed. Whether they lived out their final years in hiding, continuing their work under new names, or whether they met a violent end remains a mystery. The case of the Convent of Eternal Tears stands as one of the most chilling examples of systematic human experimentation in American history. The sisters had combined cold scientific precision with complete moral corruption, creating a program of treatment that destroyed hundreds of lives while advancing medical understanding. Their records, preserved despite their flight, reveal procedures that would not be recognized by mainstream medicine for decades, accelerating neuroscience at a price no one should have had to pay. The scandal also revealed a grim truth about early American society, that social prejudice and institutional power made it possible for such atrocities to remain hidden for more than 20 years. Families who had sent their daughters to the convent chose silence rather than scandal. Government officials sealed records to protect public order, and medical institutions quietly integrated the sisters' findings into their own research. This conspiracy of silence ensured that the victim's suffering was nearly erased from memory, and serves as a warning to us today. When the pursuit of knowledge is divorced from morality, when progress is valued more than people, horrors like this are not just possible, they are inevitable. Could something like this still happen today, hidden behind the polished doors of modern laboratories, cloaked in the language of science and social good? The past suggests that it could. If this story unsettled you, share it with someone who loves uncovering the darker side of history. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the shadows of our past still hold countless secrets waiting to be revealed.